Right, I'm going to make a start, ladies and gentlemen. Can I begin by welcoming you to this, the 5th of our online seminars. We trust that everything's going to go very well, but this is on rented Wi-Fi in a cottage in the Yorkshire Dales. So if by any chance the power goes off, James Bowen will take over. So if we disappear, there will be some continuity. I called this session Ploughing a Literary Furrow, popular writing about 20th century English agriculture. This comes about because I realized that two friends, Paul and Peter, were engaged in rather similar projects. But I suppose Paul and Peter haven't seen each other for some time. And Paul and Peter were completely unaware of the fact that they were both ploughing a literary furrow. So this is a little bit of creative matchmaking to bring two stalwart members of a society together and look at the generality of writing about agriculture in the 20th century, which Paul is going to do, and then to look at one of the most prominent celebrity writers of the interwar years and after, which Peter's going to do. So I hope that these two papers are going to cohere very well indeed, and are going to take the audience into places where we perhaps haven't gone in recent years. This is not an area which has attracted a great deal of attention. So I think that both papers can, in their own ways, claim to be pioneering. So with no more ado, can I invite Paul to take the stage? And your paper, Paul, is The Farm in the Library, Writing About Agriculture in the 20th Century. Paul.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. You have to blame Jeremy Burkhardt, who I see is here with us today, because he introduced me to, or he introduced Paddy Bullard to me, and Paddy is producing a book on the history of English Georgic writing, and this is a chapter for that, or this originally comes from a chapter that I've written for that book. And my chapter is about 20th century Georgic and agricultural technology, and I would emphasize the agricultural technology, because clearly you could talk about all sorts of aspects of Georgic, but it's the technical aspect that I'm concentrating on. So in case it's not a term that you use every day, let's look at what Georgic actually is. It's some part of the science of agriculture put into a pleasing dress, according to Joseph Addison, who in the early 18th century translated Virgil's Georgics. An alternative, rather more recent version is that it's a didactic version of pastoral, in which the intention is to idealize country life as a life of industry, not idleness. And that's John Barrell and John Bull in the Penguin Book of Pastoral Verse, which I imagine is on everyone's bookshelf. So that difference between Georgic and pastoral, I think, is important, and I think you'll see why. The classic historical question, of course, is continuity or change, and there are bits of evidence for both of them. If you look at a rather well-known poem by Thomas Hardy, in which he refers to only a man harrowing clods in a slow, silent walk, yet this will go onward the same, though dynasties pass. And he wrote that in a poem called In Time of the Breaking of Nations in the First World War. So he's obviously associating himself with continuity, whereas if we look at a rather more recent poet, R.S. Thomas, you should see Kindlean on a tractor, gone the old look that yoked him to the soil. He's a new man now, part of the machine, and that's the Welsh priest poet R.S. Thomas in 1952, writing in 1952. Well, I argue that both of these two poets reflect their times: before the Second World War, continuity; after the Second World War, change. But perhaps, as we might see, the pre-World War II writers certainly do it more, and I think for some people do it better. So what we're interested in, I think, is what we might call the period of the real agricultural revolution, as opposed to the one that we all talk about. In other words, the period for which that is an icon, the period from the Second World War onwards up to about the mid-1980s. And clearly it's obviously based, as Peter Dewey has reminded us so effectively in his book on agricultural engineering. It's partly a matter of engineering, it's partly a matter of chemistry for fertilizers and pesticides, partly a matter of genetics for new varieties of crops and new breeds of livestock, and the whole lot, in a sense, stimulated by post-war agricultural policy. But I'm not going to. I'm going to assume that we don't need to bother about the details of that. What I would draw your attention to is that before the Second World War, A.G. Street, of whom you'll hear more later, wrote that the farmer has no pride in his occupation and the zest has gone out of agriculture. Whereas after the Second World War, Tristram Beresford, who was both a farmer and an agricultural journalist who farmed, in fact, not very far away from Street, he wrote that farming has recovered its spirit and zest and vocation. It's dug up its buried talent and put it to work. So these two writers, again, suggesting that there's a pre and post-war difference. And the question is, to what extent does that show up in writing about agriculture, Georgical writing? Well, we can divide Georgic, I'm going to argue, into a number of categories. We can look at farmers' notes, accounts, diaries and letters, very often unpublished. And I'm not going to talk about those simply because they're not published. And then there are textbooks, surveys and descriptions, memoirs and fiction, which I am going to talk about. And arguably part of the story, you might say, is rural history or agricultural history and journalism. I mean, if we want to know about what was going on in 20th century agriculture, then there's a great deal of journalism that will inform us. But again, I'm not going to talk about histories and journalism because we would be here until tomorrow morning, I think. So let's look at the first of these categories. Textbooks obviously were around before the 20th century. I'm going to call that the age of fossil. The older members may remember George, who was one of the founders of the British Agricultural History Society, and died at the age of 100 on the 1st of January 1990. And I remember him when I first got involved with the society, and most of the time he used to frighten me to death. But he wrote a series of Old English farming books, Old English farming books of 1947, more Old English farming books, still more Old English farming books than you could possibly imagine, right up to 1900, so before the 20th century. It's fossil. But after that, I think we can divide the textbooks into the general and the specialist. And the first sort of late 19th century that came into being was Freeme's Elements of Agriculture, and shortly after Watson and Moore, or at the beginning of the 20th century, I suppose, Watson and Moore produced their book on agriculture. And these things went through numerous editions. I mean, I think Freeme is probably still in print. The last edition of Watson and Moore was in the 1960s. And what they reflect is the rise in the number of university and college courses in agriculture. The agricultural notebook, this one on the top left here, was slightly different in that it was designed to fit into your pocket, and it was simply data, without attempting too much explanation. Over time, it evolved, and so that the 21st edition, what you've got here is a picture of the 9th edition, which came out in 1919. The 21st edition came out a couple of months ago, and it's now an agricultural textbook. In fact, it's probably the main single volume agricultural textbook. But of course, agricultural students also use specialist volumes, and I've picked out a number here: Howland and Garnon on feeding farm animals, Russell's Soil Conditions and Plant Growth. A lot of these went through numerous editions, and they are a very good source for technical change, but they're not. You couldn't say that they spend too much time idealizing rural life as a life of industry. It's much more about latest changes in agricultural science and the sort of basics of agriculture, if you like. So the other category that I should mention are the surveys, which I think come closer to Georgic. They're much more likely to idealize rural life in the process of describing it, particularly streets farming in England, I think. And of course, what you find is that in that book on farming in England, Street again backs up my argument. He says, will the readers of this book think of agriculture as a great industry or an old-fashioned relic? And Astor and Rowntree, in their book British Agriculture, Principles for Future Policy, are examining the role of agriculture in national life. So if we come now to the next category, which is the novels before 1939, I mean, this is what I think many people would consider the real subject of this talk. And there was a great outpouring of imaginative literature on rural life between the wars. Glenn Cavaliero, who wrote a book called Rural Tradition in the English Novel, 1900 to 1939, counted 217 of these rural novels. Rural doesn't necessarily equate to Georgic, but in terms of rural novels, there were a lot of them. And a lot of people have called these the sort of Lohman love child school of writing, and argued that their emotional and literary significance was greater, or that the emotional and literary significance of agriculture was greater than its economic significance in this period. So when you look at authors like H.E. Bates, H.W. Freeman, Constance Holm, Winifred Holtby, Sheila K. Smith, they're producing what Elizabeth Outker has recently referred to as commodified authentic. The commodity, if you like, was the idea of authentic rural life. We might add in Sylvia Townsend Warner and Mary Webb and Henry Williamson, who I think probably did involve himself a bit more in the story of the Norfolk farm in actually describing agricultural technology. But the others, I think, are very debatably about rural or about farming, and not much about technology. The farm in most of these books, it seems to me, is more of a metaphor for, or farming, if you like, is more of a metaphor for honesty and virtue, or for human relationships. You know, if the farm fails, then that's a sign that the marriage is failing, and what they're more interested in are the personal relationships and the marriage. And as far as technology is concerned, then tradition is everything. And I'm thinking of things like H.E. Bates's The Fallow Land, or Sheila K. Smith's Joanna Godden. That's the way I would see them. Others, I think, might take a different view. But there is, and of course, when you look at these, you can see where Stella Gibbons is getting her material from to take the mickey out of them. But there is clearly a Georgic line in Vita SackvilleWest's long poem, A Land. Here's Vita SackvilleWest looking as only Vita SackvilleWest could, and The Land is 2,500 lines, so it's a very long poem. I mean, it was sold as a book basically, and it begins: I sing the cycle of my country's year, I sing the tillage and the reaping sing, classic monotony that modes and wars leave undisturbed and unbettered. So she's obviously part of the continuity school. On the other hand, she does refer to drills, seed drills, and binders as traditional. So we could, I guess, argue about that. But when I first came across this poem, I thought, well, 1926 is interesting. Surely she must be responding to T.S. Eliot, who, of course, produced The Wasteland just 2 or 3 years before this. But actually, it turns out she wasn't. She was simply responding to a journalistic comment that nobody wrote about occupations any longer. But I think, A Land kind of stands out as something very different from most of what was being produced in this period. The things that people associate probably most with this period are memoirs, and the two major figures are Adrian Bell and A.G. Street. Bell farmed or went to work on a farm in East Anglia, and he writes about traditional East Anglian arable farming. It's part of a corduroy is the first volume of a trilogy, and in the third volume, The Cherry Tree, he does start to talk about technical changes that were happening in the 1930s. And he does so even more in a novel that he wrote a little bit later called By Road. And it's interesting to look at his take on technology, which is at least slightly disapproving. I mean, he's a great advocate for the strengths of traditional East Anglian arable farming, in a way that, say, Hugh Barrett, who wrote a book called Early to Rise, about more or less the same period, also writes slightly differently, but points out the strengths of East Anglian arable that enabled it to survive the interwar, the problems of interwar farming. Street's Farmer's Glory is just as well known, if perhaps not better known. I'm not going to say anything more about it though, because I've no doubt that Peter will say more about it. But I would point out that that Street was also wrote novels. He wrote Strawberry Roan and The Gentleman of the Party, among others. And these two are not the only memoirists, obviously. I mean, there's Thomas Furbank's book, I Bought a Mountain, which is about farming in the farming in the Welsh mountains. Frank Fraser Darling's Island Farm, about farming off the west coast of Scotland. And a book which I think is largely forgotten now by Robert Homewood, called Three Farms, which is about the particular problems of tenant farming, and how dairy farming in particular becomes much easier once the Milk Marketing Board is formed in 1933. Well, then we come to the Second World War, and as I'm arguing, the period in which farming recovers its zest. Interestingly, Cavaliero simply states there is no rural fiction after the Second World War. And that sounds a bit stark, but actually it's quite difficult to disagree. There are memoirs, but fiction, not so much. What we've heard a great deal about are people like the writers who form the kinship in husbandry, people like Massingham, Rolf Gardner, Henry Williamson was one of them, Gerard Wallop, the Earl of Portsmouth, Thomas Hennell, Philip Euler, Duncan, Ronald Duncan, Jorian Jenks. They wrote a great deal, and they have been much written about. And it's very tempting to just dismiss them as, well, basically as fascists. And it's a temptation that I'm going to give into. So let's carry on to the John Stuart Collis, and in his book, which is probably most familiar as The Worm Forgives the Plough, actually came out in two separate volumes. But Collis and the Hendersons, George Henderson in his book, The Farming Ladder, and the Hosier brothers are much more interested in technical change, and of course they're farming in a period where technical change becomes much more important. The kinship and husbandry people have got a very mixed view of technical change. I mean, some are violently against any kind of technical change, and others can kind of just about put up with it. But Street, I think, and again, I apologize, Peter, in coming back to Street, but it's difficult to avoid. Street makes the point that the Second World War and afterwards is the period where farming recovers its zest, and you can see it in these things, and in books like Ruth Janet Ruck's A Place of Stones. She was a farm pupil with Henderson. Street writes, "There is little doubt," and he wrote this in 1951, "there is little doubt that the present prosperity of British agriculture is mainly due to one man, who is now dead. His name was Adolf Hitler." So the recovery of the zest to the Second World War and what happened afterwards in what I guess we might call, from a Georgic viewpoint, the unspoken agricultural revolution. It's not unspoken by writers like Beresford and the Donaldsons, who were writing these surveys of agriculture, and it's interesting if you look at the Donaldson book, for example, they go out of their way to contrast what they refer to as the present appearance of rural England with its broken backed appearance of yesterday. And likewise, Beresford in We Plough the Fields talked about agriculture recovering its zest. And if we look at the memoirs of the time, I don't have an illustration of them, but John Cherrington's book. Cherrington was both a farmer and an agricultural journalist. Wrote a book called On the Smell of an Oily Rag. Tony Harmon's 70 Summers. Arthur Court's Seed Time to Harvest. Interestingly, what all of these memoirs do is to contrast the pre-war period, when those three began farming, with the post-war period where they actually made some money out of farming. And if you look at Ronald Blythe's Aikenfield, which I think is pretty well known, Blythe recognizes that that things have changed, but you can't say that he really celebrates them. He's almost he almost bewails, I think, in parts these changes. And so it's interesting that a real farmer like Fred Archer, when he took to writing, always went back. I mean, when village bells were silent, was about the Second World War, but it's the closest he got to. Most of the time, he was writing about Victorian and Edwardian farming. And the other sort of trope is farming is a funny business, and an example of that is John Holgate's trio, one of which I've illustrated here. And then what we find after 1985 is what I think it's difficult to call anything other than anti-Georgic, and it shows you the impact of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which appeared in 1963, and what is almost a companion volume by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines, which appeared the following year. And they both point out the problems of modern agriculture. Carson is particularly, of course, interested in fertilizers and pesticides. Harrison is most interested in intensive animal production, but she also has a go at its impact on the landscape. So their heirs, I guess, are novelists like Christopher Hart, Jane Beeson, Sam North, etc., who talk about the problems of rural life, or in the case of Jane Beeson and Sam North, both of whom are writing about Dartmoor, which is where I'm speaking to you from, but they're much more interested in the impact of property changes on Dartmoor, farms being sold off to visitors. Tom Bullock down at the end there is interested in the influence of places on people, a bit like Bruce Chatwin's On the Black Hill. And then there are the non-fiction writers. Richard Benson is writing about the failure of his family farm. Tim Dee and John Lewis Stemple are writing about wildlife on farms. James Rebanks, of course, has been very popular and I would argue is largely glorifying the traditional approach to farming. And of course, Isabella Tree has also achieved a lot of attention for her book on rewilding. But it's worth pointing out that there is a publishing company called Old Pond Publishing, which revels in celebrating agricultural machinery and agricultural technology, but particularly agricultural machinery. Titles like 70 Years of Farm Tractors and Oily Hands and the Smell of Diesel. So to try and bring this to a conclusion, obviously what I've been talking about very much emphasizes technical change, as does the chapter that I've written for Paddy Bullard's book. If we were writing about agricultural labor, it might be a rather different paper, but I was concentrating on technology. And I've very much been looking at the context, not the text. You won't find, you have not had a great deal of textual analysis in what I'm saying. What I've been trying to do is relate to the writers to the periods in which they were writing. And so if we have to try and sum up the pre-Second World War period, it's a period where perhaps the readers were interested in escapism and the writers were interested in arguing for some level of respect for rural life. And whereas post-war, the demise of any significant rural fiction, and therefore I think we might argue that the technical change that we've seen since the war writers haven't felt it necessary to celebrate or emphasize it, possibly because, as Claire Griffiths argues, there was a great deal of post-war respect for farmers, so there was perhaps no need to argue for it, or maybe the commercial success did not produce sympathy for the plight of people trying to make a living from farming. And of course, after 1985, a combination of the costs of the CAP, environmental problems, animal welfare problems, all led to anti-Georgic. So that is a point, I think, at which I will stop.